In the dry autumn of 1887, a widow named Orla Vance walked out to the deadest 40 acres in all of Sabbath Reach, Colorado, knelt down in dirt so cracked it had split into plates a man could lift like broken crockery, and began to dig a ditch by hand toward a spring nobody else in the whole valley believed still ran. She was 31 years old that season, with $11 sewn into the hem of her skirt and 2 children asleep in a wagon behind her, and by the time the men down at the Antler Creek feed store had heard about it, the town had a name for her. They called her the Ditch Widow, and they laughed about it through 2 dry seasons and 1 hard winter. Right up until the summer, the great drought came down on the high country like a closed fist and burned every pasture and every hayfield and every stock pond from the mountains to the river to gray bone dust, every field but hers. She had not gone soft in the head with grief. She had read a thing in the land itself, in the lay of the rock and the run of the water underground, that not one of those laughing men had ever bothered to kneel down and learn. That is the whole shape of it, told plain. What I am going to hold back from you, as the valley held it back from itself for the better part of a year, is how a starving widow with a borrowed shovel and no money and no man to help her ever moved enough water across dead ground to keep one green field alive while the rest of the world turned to dust. Because that is the part worth waiting for. That is the part her own neighbors would come and stand at her fence to see with their own eyes, hats in their hands, before the thing was through. Let me show her to you as she was that first afternoon, because you are going to want to know her before the town does. She was a tall woman gone lean, as the frontier makes a woman lean. All the softness worked off her in the years since the fever had taken her husband and left her to hold the place alone. Her hands were the first thing a body noticed about her, big-knuckled and chapped raw at the wrists, the nails broken down to the quick, the palms gone the color and hardness of saddle leather. She wore a faded work dress the color of weak tea. Washed so many times the pattern had given up, and over her shoulders a wool shawl she kept rolled back to the elbows so it would not catch on the shovel. Her cheeks had sunk in over that last thin winter until the bones of her face stood out plain, and her hair she wore pulled straight back and pinned without any care for how it looked, because there was no one left to look. She did not walk so much as she went, head down, shoulders set, going at a thing she had already decided cannot be argued out of them. If you have once watched a whole town make up its mind that a steady, capable person had lost their grip, decided it over coffee, and repeated it until it hardened into the truth of the place, then you already understand something about why a story like this one needs telling. So before we go on, do me one small kindness. Tell me down in the comments what town you are listening from tonight, the place where you are sitting, near or far. And if this is the kind of story you would follow clear to the end, press the little button that lets more folks like you find it. It costs you nothing, and it keeps stories like Orla Vance's from being lost. Now settle in, because we have got a long way to go, and I promise you the walk is worth it. The 40 acres had come to her as most bad land comes to a widow, which is to say it came cheap, and it came with a story nobody would tell her straight. Her husband had bought the parcel 2 summers before the fever off a man named Piet Halloran, who was leaving the valley in a hurry and did not much want to explain why. The deed said 40 acres, more or less, bounded to the north by the county road with the western line along the dry wash they called Miller's Cut, and it said nothing at all about the fact that the ground would not hold a crop. Her husband had known It was thin. He had figured on breaking his back to sweeten it a little every year, as a young man figures, and then the fever came through in the wet spring and took him in 9 days and took the neighbor's boy and the schoolmaster besides, and it left Orla standing in a doorway with a deed to 40 acres of ground that the rest of Sabbath Reach had already written off before she ever owned it. They told her, the few who bothered to tell her anything, that she ought to sell it back to the bank and take her children east to whatever people she had left. The man who told her this most plainly was the president of the Antler Creek Stockman's Bank, a heavy, careful man named Cyrus Broadwater, who wore a gold watch chain across a vest that had never once been dusty, and who spoke to her across his desk in the tone a man uses on a child he is being patient with. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I will be honest with you, because I think you have earned honesty. That parcel your husband bought, rest his soul, is what we in the trade call a dry claim. There is no water on it that a body can reach. The wash runs 3 weeks in the spring, and it is a bed of stones the rest of the year. I have watched 2 men before your husband break themselves on that ground. I would not be doing my duty by you if I let you believe there was a living in it. And if I do not sell," she said, "then you will owe the note on it come the first of the year," he said, "same as your husband would have. $92 and some cents, against ground that cannot make you 92 cents. I am telling you the arithmetic of it, Mrs. Vance. The arithmetic does not care that you have had a hard turn." She sat there in front of him with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not argue the arithmetic, because she could not. She only looked at him for a long moment, and then she said a thing that he would repeat later, in the feed store and at the Sunday board, as proof the widow had gone strange. "There is water there," she said. "You have just none of you gone looking for it in the right place." Cyrus Broadwater smiled as a man smiles when he has decided to be kind instead of correct. "Everybody who has ever owned a dry claim has believed that," he said gently. "It is a thing the ground does to hopeful people. Now, shall I draw the papers for the sale, or shall I not?" She stood up. She smoothed the front of her tea-colored dress with both of those ruined hands, and she told him he could hold his papers. And she walked out of the Stockman's Bank into the bright dry street with her chin level, and every man who saw her go believed he had just watched a foolish woman throw her own children into the road. Here is the thing she had not told the banker, and a thing she would not tell any of them, and a thing this whole story turns on. She had not made up the water out of hope. She had gotten it out of a book. The book was a slim, foxed, hand-sewn thing in oilcloth covers gone soft as cloth at the corners, and it had belonged to her grandmother, and before that to a man Orla had never met, a Cornish miner and ditch tender named Trewin, who had come across the water in the hungry years and worked the copper country and the placer diggings clear out to the far mountains before he ever settled. It was not a diary, and it was not a Bible, though she kept it as some people keep a Bible. It was a working man's memorandum book, the pages ruled in a cramped hand and half in a language she could not read, full of little drawings, cross-sections of hillsides with the water tables sketched in, tables of fall and grade, notes on how a ditch must drop just so far and no farther over a given run or the water will not go, notes on how to read a slope for where the water hides, how a line of a certain kind of green marks a seep even in a dry year, how the old countrymen had moved water across dead ground for 1,000 years by the simple, patient law that water will always go downhill if you give it a road end. Never once let the road go up. Her grandmother had read that book to her by lamplight when Orla was a girl no higher than a churn. In a sod house on a different frontier, in a different dry country, and the old woman had made her learn the pages as other children learned their letters, and she had said a thing to Orla more than once that the girl had not understood until she was a widow standing on 40 dead acres. The men will always tell you there is no water, her grandmother had said, in the accent she never lost. They tell you that because they only ever look at the top of the ground. The water is not up where the eye falls. Learn to read where it goes under, my heart, and you will never be as poor as they think you are. So when Cyrus Broadwater told her there was no water on her claim, Orla Vance had not been guessing when she told him he was wrong. She had walked that 40 acres 3 times over already before she ever sat down in his office, and she had done it with the oilcloth book open in her hand and up along the western line where the dry wash of Miller's Cut came down out of the higher ground. In a fold of rock most people rode past without a glance, she had found the thing the book had taught her to look for. A line of green, a narrow ribbon of a coarse, dark rush that had no business growing in that country in that season, following along the foot of the rock for 100 yards and more, and where the rush grew thickest she had knelt down and dug with her fingers and felt the soil go cool and then damp and then, at the length of her forearm down, wet, not a stream, not a pond a man could point at. A seep, a spring that had gone underground and lost itself in the rock, that gave up maybe a barrel of water in an hour into ground that drank it before it could ever show itself on the surface where a banker or a stockman might notice. It was, by every measure that Sabbath Reach used to measure water, no water at all. It watered nothing. It ran nowhere. It sat in the rock at the high western corner of 40 dead acres, and it did the whole valley no good whatsoever. But Orla Vance had a book that told her water will go downhill so long as it is given a road, and she had 40 acres of ground that fell, gentle and even, from that high western corner down to the eastern road, and she had 2 strong arms and a great deal of time. Because a woman the whole town has written off has nothing but time. And she had done the sum that Cyrus Broadwater, for all his gold watch chain, had never thought to do. She had figured that if she could dig one narrow channel from that hidden seep, laid at just the fall the old book prescribed, and no more, she could gather that hour-by-hour barrel of water and lead it, a little at a time, down across the dying ground, and she could grow the one crop her grandmother's country had grown in the wet hollows of a dry land, the one crop that did not need rich soil, only patient water and a floor of sand and a low place to hold it. She told the banker none of that. She told no one at all. She had learned, in 31 hard years, that a thing said out loud in Sabbath Reach became a thing the men could take away from you or laugh out of you before you had a chance to make it real. So she kept the book in the bottom of the flour barrel where no one would think to look, and she kept the plan behind her teeth, and at first light the following day, before the sun was full up over the eastern rim. She took her husband's old long-handled shovel out to the high western corner of the deadest ground in Sabbath Reach, set the blade against the crust, put her whole weary weight on it, and began to dig. That first morning she dug for 4 hours and moved a channel 11 feet long, and her hands bled through her gloves. And she went back to the wagon where her children waited, and she did not tell them what the digging was for either. Her son was 9 that autumn, a solemn, watchful boy named Dell, who had gone quiet in the manner of children who have watched a parent die and her daughter was 6, a round-faced, tender little thing called Susanna, who still asked most nights when her father was coming back. Orla fed them cornmeal mush with a little bacon grease worked through it, and she told them they were going to make the farm live. And Dell looked at her across the fire with his father's careful eyes and asked her how on that ground, and she told him the only true thing she could tell him. By digging, she said, a little every day. You will help me, and your sister will carry water, and we will not tell the town what we are about, because the town would only tell us we cannot. Can you keep a thing behind your teeth, Dell? Yes, Mama, the boy said. Then keep this one, she said. It is the most important thing you will ever keep. Now, understand how the valley was shaped, because the shape of it is the whole quiet argument this story makes. Sabbath Reach lay in a long bowl of high country between 2 shoulders of red rock, and down the middle of the bowl ran the reach itself, a thin brown creek that in a good year watered the whole valley, and in a bad year shrank back to a chain of green pools with a mile of dry stones between them. Every ranch and every farm in the valley had been laid out along the creek, because water was the creek, and the creek was water, and that was the beginning and the end of what the valley's men knew about the subject. The big outfits held the creek land. The biggest of them all was the Broken Bit, run by a rancher named Ferris Coyle, a broad, red, loud man who ran better than 2,000 head of cattle and who held the best 3 miles of the reach and never once in his life imagined a day when the creek might not be enough. Below him along the water lay the smaller places, the Dutchman's hay ground. The 2 Ostrander brothers with their milk cows, the Widow Salt's kitchen garden, all of them strung along the creek like beads because the creek was the only thing anyone believed in. And up on the dry benches above the creek, on ground nobody wanted, sat the failed and the foolish and the poor. That was where Orla Vance's 40 acres lay. High ground, dry ground, ground above the water, which in Sabbath Reach meant ground that was as good as dead. It was the very fact that her land sat high, above and away from the creek everyone fought over, that made the whole town so sure she was mad. She had no creek. She was too high for the creek. And what none of them understood, what her grandmother's book understood and Ferris Coyle never would, was that ground which sits high above a valley is also ground with a great deal of country lying below it, and water that comes out of the high rock has a very long way that it is willing to run downhill if only somebody will give it the road. She gave it the road. She gave it the road 11 feet at a time, 4 and 5 hours a day, all through that first dry autumn, while the valley below her watered its stock at the shrinking creek and paid her no mind at all. The digging was not the simple thing that a town would later imagine it to be when the town got around to imagining it. A woman does not merely scratch a trench in the dirt and let the water find its own way. The whole art of it, the art that filled half the oilcloth book in the cramped Cornish hand, was in the fall. Water is a stubborn, lazy, honest thing. Give a channel too steep a drop, and the water runs fast and tears the banks out and cuts itself a gully and is gone before it can soak a single acre. Give the channel no fall at all, or worse, let the bottom of it rise even a hand's width anywhere along its run, and the water simply stops, backs up, sinks into the ground, and never reaches the far end at all. The dead Cornishman had known this to the inch. His book gave the rule the old country ditch men had carried down the centuries, that a good field channel should drop about 1 foot in every 400, no steeper, so that the water walks rather than runs, so that it moves the whole distance without ever cutting or ever stalling. And it gave a way of checking that fall with nothing more than a clay bowl of water, a straight board, and a string weighted with a musket ball, which was the only kind of tool a widow with $11 was ever going to own. So Orla did not just dig. Every few feet she stopped and set her straight board across the fresh channel and hung her weighted string off the end of it and read the fall by the method her grandmother had drilled into her. And where the drop was too much, she raised the bottom with tamped earth, and where the drop was too little, she cut deeper, and she went on down the slope of the 40 acres in that painstaking crawling. Way, checking and cutting and checking again, so that anyone watching from the road, if anyone had bothered to watch, would have seen a lone woman kneeling in a dead field, bent over a bowl of water like a person praying to it, and would have gone home and reported that the widow had truly lost her senses now. She was building a thing so exact that the eye could not see it worked at all until the day the water ran, and that was precisely how she wanted it. A ditch that shows nothing is a ditch nobody thinks to interfere with. The children helped as children can. Little Susanna's whole task was the rushes. Her mother had trained her to know the coarse, dark rush that marked the wet places, and the girl would go along the base of the western rock with a flour sack and gather the young rush shoots her mother pointed out, and these Orla replanted in wet clumps down the length of the channel, both to hold the banks with their roots and because the old book said a line channel of living rush lost far less of its water to the thirsty ground than a bare cut of raw dirt did. Dell did the man's share, or tried to, working the far end of the shovel when his mother's arms gave out, hauling the loose spoil off in a barrow with a wheel that shrieked, tamping the low spots down with the butt end of a fence rail until his hands were as raw as his mother's. And in the evenings, when the light was gone and the digging was done, Orla would take the oilcloth book out of the flour barrel by the fire and read the boy the parts he could understand, the parts about fall and grade and the reading of the ground. Not to make him a ditch man before his time, but so that if anything ever happened to her, the knowledge would not die on that dead ground with the rest of it. That was how her grandmother had taught it, and the grandmother before that, all down the long line of women who bore a book of buried water from one parched country into the next. "Why does the town say we cannot, Mama?" Dell asked her one night, when the wind was working at the wagon canvas and Susanna was asleep against his shoulder. "If the book knows how, why do they not know how?" She thought about that for a while, because he had asked her a true question, and a false answer was the last thing she meant to give him. "Because the book is old," she said at last, "and the men of this valley are young, and a young man thinks the world began the day he first saw it. There has always been water under dry ground, Dell, and there have always been people who knew how to lead it. But it is quiet knowing. It does not shout, and a valley like this one only believes in what shouts. It believes in the creek because the creek is loud and a man can point at it. Our water is quiet. It comes up in the rock where no one looks, and it goes down through a ditch a person can barely see, and it will grow us a crop no one here has ever grown, and none of it will ever once shout. That is why they will laugh when they find out. And they will find out. Let them laugh. A laughing man is a man who has stopped paying attention, and that is a very good thing for us. The crop she meant to grow was the second secret, and it was the one that would have gotten her laugh the hardest, so she kept it the deepest. In the wet hollows of her grandmother's old country, and in a few cold, sandy corners of the far northern states where the Cornish and the Dutch and the old country people had carried it, there grew a small, hard tart red berry on a low creeping vine, a berry that wanted nothing to do with rich black soil, that in fact rotted and died in ground a wheat farmer would call good, and that instead wanted exactly what everyone else in Sabbath Reach thought of as worthless. It wanted sand. It wanted a floor of poor acid sandy ground, a low place where water could be let in and held in a shallow sheet for a season, and then let out again, and it wanted patience. 3 years of patience before it would give a real crop. And in return it would give a fruit that kept all winter without spoiling, that traveled 1,000 miles in a barrel and arrived sound, that a town cook would pay hard money for at the turn of the year when every other fresh thing was long gone. A cranberry, a bogberry, a crop that turned the two things Sabbath Reach was sure a person could not farm: dry, high sand and hidden water, into the two exact things it needed most. Orla had seen the bogs worked as a girl. She had waded them at the harvest with her hems knotted at the knee when the men flooded the low ground and knocked the berries loose off the vines with wooden rakes, so that they floated up red and thick to the surface of the water in a sheet you could have walked across if water would hold you. She had that picture in her as a person keeps the picture of a thing they loved as a child, and standing on her own dead 40 acres she had understood, with the book open in her hands, that the low even fall of her ground toward the county road, and the sandy poverty of the soil that made it worthless for wheat, and the hidden seep up in the western rock, were not 3 curses. They were the 3 exact ingredients of a bog. She had not been left a dry claim. She had been left, though not one soul in the valley could see it, the makings of the only cranberry bog in 400 miles. But a bog is not made in a season, and it is not made by one woman with a shovel, not the whole of it. So Orla was patient in the manner the very poor learn to be patient, which is to say she did the next needful thing and did not let herself grieve the size of the hole. That first autumn she dug the channel downhill from the seep as far as the first low fold of ground, and there, in a natural shallow saucer of an acre or so, where the water wanted to gather anyway, she banked up a low earthen dike on the downhill side, a berm no higher than her knee. Tamped hard and faced with turf, with a simple plug of a gate she could open and shut, a squared timber butt she could pull to let the water out, and drive home to hold it in. And into that first flooded acre, once the channel had led enough of the quiet water down to wet it, she set the first cuttings. She had brought the cuttings a long way. The vines had come with her from the east, a whole trunk lined with damp moss and packed with the runners she had cut from an old bog the old country folk had worked, kept alive across the whole journey west with water she could ill spare, tended in a shaded box behind the wagon like they were the children's 3rd sibling. Everyone who had seen the box on the trail had assumed the widow was carrying flowers, some sentimental green thing from a dead husband's garden, and she had let them think it, because a woman carrying flowers is only sad. But a woman carrying the start of a fortune is a woman somebody watches. She set the runners into the wet sand of that first banked acre in the last warm days of the autumn, pressed each one down by hand, and she knew as she did it that she would not see a berry worth selling off them for 3 full years, and that she would have to keep 2 children and herself alive on that dead ground for 3 full years, while the town laughed, and she set them anyway, one runner at a time, on her knees in the mud. Because her grandmother had told her that the poor plant for a harvest they may not live to eat, and there lies the whole difference between the poor who rise and the poor who stay down. The town found out about the digging before the winter, as a town always finds out, through a boy on a horse. It was one of the Ostrander boys, the younger one, riding the bench road looking for a strayed milk cow, who came over the ridge that overlooks Miller's Cut in the low afternoon light, and saw the widow down in her dead field on her hands and knees with a shovel and a barrow, and a strange, long, dark scar cut across the ground behind her, running down toward the county road, and a queer, low bank of raw earth thrown up in the hollow, and 2 children hauling wet sacks. He sat his horse a long while and watched, and he could make no sense of it at all, and he rode home and told his father, and his father passed it around the feed store, and by the second, telling the strange dark scar had become a grave the widow was digging, and by the fourth telling she had been seen talking to the dirt. And by the time the story had gone clear around the stove at the Antler Creek feed store, it had settled into the version the town would keep, which was that grief had finally turned the Vance widow's mind, and that she was up on her worthless bench land digging ditches to nowhere and burying her hopes in dry sand, and that somebody ought, in Christian charity, to go up there and take those 2 children away from her before she starved them or worse. That last part frightened her more than any laughter ever could, and when word of it came down to her, as such words do, carried up the bench by the widow Salt, who was the one soul in Sabbath Reach with any kindness in her, Orla Vance understood that the secret she had been keeping to protect her plan, she now had to keep to protect her children. So she did a hard, clever thing. She went down into Sabbath Reach on a Saturday, into the very middle of the town's market day, with Dell scrubbed and Susanna in her one clean pinafore, and she stood in the street and let them see that her children were fed and clean and quick and cared for. And when Ferris Coyle himself, the big, red, broken bit man, called across the wagons to her, with the whole street listening, she gave the town the story she wanted it to have. Mrs. Vance, Coyle boomed, in the loud, jolly voice of a man performing kindness for an audience, "The boys tell me you have got yourself a mighty long ditch dug up there on that dry bench. Now what in the world does a body water on a bench with no creek? You growing rocks up there, you raising a crop of dust." And the men around him laughed the easy laugh of men who have been given permission to laugh. Orla could have told him the truth and been believed by no one. She could have said nothing and left him the grave-digging story. Instead, she smiled a small, tired widow's smile, and she said, in a voice pitched to carry just far enough, "I am draining it, Mr. Coyle. The low corner of my ground holds the wet all winter and rots what little I can grow. My grandmother's people drained wet ground with a ditch back east, and I am draining mine. It is dull work, and it makes no crop yet, but it will make a garden of that corner by another year, enough to keep us. That is all it is. A drainage ditch and a poor woman's garden." It was a masterpiece of a lie, because every word of it was very nearly true, and because it took the most alarming thing about her, a widow talking of hidden water where the bank swore there was none, and made it the most ordinary thing in the world, a woman draining a wet corner. Draining ground the men understood. Draining ground was sensible. Draining ground was not madness, only drudgery, and drudgery in a widow is nothing to take her children over. Ferris Coyle laughed again, louder, satisfied, and told her that if draining a bog was what made her happy she was welcome to it, that the whole bench could slide off into the ocean for all it was worth, and the men laughed with him, and the danger passed. The town went back to the old nickname, only now it spoke of the ditch widow as you name a harmless eccentric with a kind of comfortable contempt, and it stopped talking about taking her children, and that was worth every ounce of the lie. But Coyle's own wife had stood at the back of that crowd, a spare, gray, watchful woman named Adelia Coyle, who said very little and saw a great deal. And she had watched the widow's face while the men laughed, and later that evening, at the Broken Bit's long supper table, she said a thing to her husband that he waved off and forgot, and that she did not. "That woman is not draining anything, Ferris," Adelia Coyle said. "I have drained wet ground. You do not do it on your knees with a clay bowl and a weighted string. She is leading water, not letting it off. She is bringing it to that corner, not taking it away. And her children are fatter than the Ostranders." "Adelia," Ferris Coyle said, tucking into his beef, "the day a starving widow on a dry bench outfarms the Broken Bit is the day I eat my own hat. Leave the poor mad thing be. I am only telling you what I saw," his wife said, and she let it go, as a wise woman lets a thing go when she has planted it and knows it will keep. But she did not forget it. And a full 2 years later, when the whole valley was on its knees, Adelia Coyle would be the one who remembered. The winter that came down on Sabbath Reach after that first autumn of digging was a lean one, and it taught Orla Vance the shape of the years ahead. The channel could not be dug when the ground was frozen iron hard, so through the cold months she turned to keeping her small household alive on almost nothing, and she learned to count her stores as a general counts his men before a losing battle. She had put up what she could from the wild country. A little dried serviceberry, a store of camas root Dell had learned to dig, a barrel of the tart wild rose hips that she boiled into a thin syrup against the winter sickness. She traded her needle down in Sabbath Reach, taking in mending from the ranch wives, and she was so good with a needle, so quick and so fine, that even the women who called her mad behind their hands would bring her their good dresses to turn, because a widow's contempt is one thing and a well-set seam is another. And she hoarded the $11 sewn in her hem as a miser hoards, breaking into it only for salt and for the note the bank held over her, spending nothing, wanting nothing. Teaching her children that to want a thing and not take it is not a punishment but a kind of strength, the strength that would one day carry them clear off the dry bench and into the whole valley's memory. The note. You must understand the note, because the note is the clock that ticks under this whole story, and every tale of this kind needs a clock. $92.40, that was the sum her husband had signed for against the 40 acres, and the Antler Creek Stockman's Bank wanted it serviced yearly, a payment of $11 and change every new year against the principal and the interest both, and if she missed a year, the bank could call the whole note, and if she could not pay the whole note, the bank could take the land. Cyrus Broadwater had told her all this across his clean desk with something almost like regret, because he was not a cruel man, only a careful one, a man who believed in arithmetic as other men believe in God, and the arithmetic said a widow on that dry high bench could not make $11 a year off dead ground, and so the arithmetic said the bank would have the land inside of 3 years. And Cyrus Broadwater had made his peace with being the instrument of arithmetic long ago. What Cyrus Broadwater did not know, and what almost no one in Sabbath Reach knew, was that behind him, quiet as a shadow, stood a man who wanted that particular 40 acres very much, and who had wanted it for a long time, and who was perfectly content to let the arithmetic and the bank do his hunkin' work for him, while he kept his own hands clean and his own face friendly. That man had sold the widow's husband the claim in the first place. That man was Piet Halloran. Piet Halloran had not left Sabbath Reach in a hurry 2 summers back because he was ruined, whatever the town believed. He had left because he had learned a thing about the 40 acres that he did not want the town to know he knew. And he had needed to get shut of the visible ownership of it before that thing became plain, and the widow's young husband, hungry for cheap land, had been the perfect fool to sell it to. Halloran had come back to the valley the next year, quiet and prosperous, gone into the freighting and the money lending, a lean, soft-spoken, courteous man with pale eyes and a way of remembering your children's names, the kind of man a town trusts precisely because he never raises his voice. From the very first week, Piet Halloran had watched the widow's ditch from a good deal closer than the Ostrander boy, and where the town saw madness, Piet Halloran saw something that turned him cold and still. Because Piet Halloran was the one man in Sabbath Reach besides Orla Vance who knew there was water in that western rock. He knew it because he had found it himself 3 summers back, poking along the base of that rock after a strayed horse. And he had seen the same dark ribbon of rush the widow's book had taught her to read. And he had dug down with his boot heel and felt the wet. And he had understood in a slow dawning greed exactly what a body might do with hidden water on high ground in a valley that fought. Over one thin creek. He had understood it, but he had not known how. He was not a ditch man. He did not have the book. He did not know the law of the fall. The single foot dropped over 400. The walking water he had tried that first summer, in secret, to scratch a channel down from the seep, and he had made it too steep in his greed to see the water run soon. And it had cut itself to a useless gully in a single storm and drowned itself in the dry sand, and he had cursed and given up and decided the water could not be got out after all, and had sold the worthless seeming claim to a fool and left, meaning to come back some day and buy it up cheap and try again with hired engineers when he had the money. And now here was the widow. Here was the ditch widow the whole town laughed at, down on her knees out in that dead field, with nothing but a shallow bowl and a plumb line of string, doing patiently and exactly the one thing Piet Halloran had failed to do in his haste, and doing it, he could see, correctly. He rode the bench road past her diggings once a week under the pretext of his freighting. And he watched the dark scar of the channel creep down the slope month by month at its perfect gentle fall, and he watched the low-banked saucer of the first bog fill and hold its shallow sheet of water where nothing had ever held water before. And Piet Halloran understood, long before the town did, that the mad widow was not mad at all, that she was going to make the water run, and that when she did, the 40 acres he had sold for a song was going to be the single most valuable piece of ground in the whole of Sabbath Reach. He did not intend to let a widow keep it, but Piet Halloran was a patient man, and there was no need to move yet. The note at the bank would come due each new year, and a widow with no crop could not pay it. And when she missed the payment, the land would come open, and Piet Halloran could buy it from the bank, quiet and lawful, with no one the wiser, with a channel already dug for him by the very woman he would put off it. So he did nothing but watch and wait, and now and again help the arithmetic along. It was Piet Halloran who, in a friendly low voice at the feed store, first floated the idea that the Vance widow was surely going to default, and that it would be a kindness to have the county look into whether those children were being kept fit. It was Piet Halloran who quietly bought up the little store debts the widow ran for her salt and her thread, so that he held more of her paper than she knew. He did it all with a courteous smile and never once raised his voice, and this is the thing about the patient predator that the loud men of a valley never see coming, that the danger to a widow is almost never the man who laughs at her in the street. The danger is the soft-spoken man in the back who is not laughing at all, because he is the only one who has understood what she is worth. Through the whole of that first winter and into the second spring, Orla had no notion that Piet Halloran existed as an enemy. She knew him only as the courteous freighter who had sold her husband the land, who tipped his hat to her on the bench road and asked after Dell by name, and she thought him one of the few decent men in a hard town. She had enemies enough that she could see, the laughing men at the feed store, the whispering that came and went about her children, the ever-ticking note at the bank, and she spent no worry on the one enemy she could not see, which is how it always goes. The second spring the ground thawed and she returned to the channel, and this was the hard middle stretch of the work, the long, unglamorous grind that the town would never know about and the whole valley would one day owe its cattle to. She had led the water down to the first banked acre. Now she had to build the true bog. That meant leveling. A cranberry bog must be dead flat inside its banks, flat as still water, because the whole trick of it is to flood it in a shallow, even sheet, and the water cannot lie even over ground that is not even. So Orla spent the whole of that spring and summer moving earth by the barrel load inside the banked acre, cutting down the high spots and packing up the low ones, dragging a heavy plank behind her like a sledge to smooth the sand flat, checking it again and again with her string and her bowl of water until the floor of that acre lay so level that when she let the channel run into it, the water spread out across the entire acre in a sheet no deeper than a hand and stayed there, even, still, holding. And in that shallow-held water the runners she had set the autumn before took hold and ran, sending their creeping vines out across the wet sand in a spreading mat of small, dark leaves that no one in Sabbath Reach recognized as anything but weed. It was brutal work, and it broke her body down. Her hands, always bad, went past bad into a thing the children were frightened by, the palms cracking open along the old callus and not healing, so that she wrapped them in rag over the mending grease and worked anyway. She grew thinner. The sunk cheeks of that first autumn sank further until the ranch wives who took their mending to her began, some of them, to feel ashamed they did not examine, handing good coin to a woman visibly starving to do their fine work. She was up before the light every day of that summer, and down in the bog until the light failed, wading in the shallow-held water with her skirts tied up and her feet bare and blue-white and wrinkled from the wet, moving earth, setting rush, pulling the weeds that would choke the young vines, and there was no one to see it and no one to praise it and no crop to show for it. Only a flat-flooded acre of weedy-looking green high on the parched bench that the whole town had agreed was the site of a widow's madness. There is a night I want to tell you about, because every account of this kind turns on such a night, and this one is the truest thing in the whole telling. It came at the low point of that second summer, in the worst of the heat. When Orla had been sick for a week with something that made her burn and shake, and had gone back to the bog too soon because the vines needed weeding and nobody else could do it, and had fainted dead away in the shallow water and come to with her face half in it and Dell dragging at her arm and screaming, and she had crawled up onto the bank and sat there in her wet dress with her cracked hands, shaking, and looked at the whole size of the thing she had taken on, and for the first and only time she had thought, clear and cold, that she could not do it, that it was too much, that a woman alone could not build a bog and keep 2 children and beat a bank, that her grandmother had been an old woman telling a girl a fairy story, that there was no fortune in the sand, only sand, and that she should take the children down to Sabbath Reach and sign Cyrus Broadwater's papers and get on the eastbound stage with whatever the bank would give her and let the water and the rush and the mad dead field sink into the sea as Ferris Coyle had said it could. She sat on the bank of the bog in the dark for a long time with that thought, and Dell sat beside her, 9 going on old, holding her ruined hand in both of his, and he did not say anything, because he was his mother's son, and he had learned that some things are not helped by talk. And after a while Orla did not reach for the papers, nor did she reach for the stage. She reached, in her mind, for the oilcloth book, for one line of it in her grandmother's reading voice, a line the old miner had written on the very last page under all his tables of fall and grade, in the only English in the whole book that was not about water. Orla knew it by heart. The old man had written, "The men above ground count what they can see and call it the whole of the wealth. But the wealth is under the ground, and it belongs to whoever has the patience to go down after it, and patience is only love that has learned to wait." She said it out loud, there in the dark, to her son. And then she got up out of the wet, and she wrapped her hands, and the next morning before the light she was back in the bog weeding the vines. And she never came that close to quitting again. That was the night the story could have ended, high on that parched bench, with a widow signing papers and a valley never knowing what it had almost lost. It did not end. And because it did not end, everything that the town of Sabbath Reach was about to learn, it was going to have to learn the hard way, out in its own dead fields, looking across a fence at the only green ground for 30 miles. If you have ever kept faith with a hard, slow thing that everyone around you called foolish, if you have gone down after a wealth that no one else could see because someone you loved once taught you where it was buried, then this story is already partly yours, and I should be glad to know it. Stay with Orla. The water is about to run, and after that, nothing in Sabbath Reach is ever the same. Now come with me to the year the rain forgot to come. The third spring did not come, as a spring should. Anyone who has lived in high, dry country knows the feeling of a spring that does not arrive. When the ground stays clenched, when the wind comes up too early out of the wrong quarter and stays, when the creek that should be brown and shouldering with snowmelt instead comes up thin and clear and low, so clear you can count the stones in it. And every rancher who sees it clear like that too early feels a cold hand lay itself on the back of his neck, because clear water in a creek in April is the creek telling you there is no snow left in the mountains to feed it. That was the spring of the great drought, the drought the old people in Sabbath Reach would date their whole lives by afterward, the before the drought and the after. And it opened as all the worst years open, with a beautiful cloudless sky. Orla Vance read the dry spring as she read everything, through her grandmother's eyes, and where the ranchers felt only the cold hand of dread, she felt something more complicated, because the same failing snowpack that was going to starve the whole valley's creek did not touch her water at all. Her water did not come from the snow of that one winter. Her seep came up out of the deep rock, out of the slow water of 100 winters stored in the stone. And a seep like that does not know or care whether it snowed last year. It gives its slow, patient barrel an hour whether the sky rains or not. And that is the quiet miracle of hidden water, and the thing no man who trusts a creek can ever quite believe until he has watched it happen. So, while the valley below her watched its creek shrink and grew afraid, Orla Vance watched her channel run exactly as it had always run, steady, low, walking its slow way down the perfect fall to the flooded bog. And she understood, with a rising and carefully hidden hope, that the very year the whole valley dreaded was going to be the year that made her. But she was not there yet, and the last hard thing had to happen first. Because it always does. It was that same dry spring that the official came. He came because Piet Halloran, patient and soft-spoken, had at last decided the time was ripe to help the arithmetic along in earnest, and he had a friend, or the ownership of a friend, in the county seat, a land office man and part-time county agent named Voss Delmfuture, a dusty, self-important little functionary who could be relied upon to find whatever a paying friend needed found. And what Piet Halloran needed found in that dry spring with the bank's note near due was an official reason to say that the Vance 40 acres was being farmed unsound, or dangerously, or against the water rights of the valley, some paper reason that would let the bank move on the note fast and hard and let a friendly buyer step in before the widow could scrape the payment together. So the county agent rode up onto the bench one bright, dreadful morning with a leather case of papers and a way of not looking at the children, and he walked the length of Orla's channel with his hands behind his back, and he stood at the edge of the flooded bog and looked at the shallow-held sheet of water with its mat of strange, dark vines, and he took out a printed form and began to write on it. And what he wrote, in the flat language of officialdom, was that the widow Vance had constructed an unpermitted diversion of subterranean water, that she was impounding water in an artificial bog to the possible detriment of those drawing on the reach below, that the enterprise showed no marketable crop and no prospect of one, and that in the judgment of the office the parcel was being used in a manner both unsound and injurious, which findings he explained to her in a dry recitation could support an action to abate the diversion and would certainly be forwarded to her lien holder. I want you to stand where Orla Vance stood that morning, because this was the true dark night, worse than the fever, worse than the bank, worse than the fainting in the water. She stood on the rim of the bog that had cost her 2 years of her body and her children's childhood and every ounce of hope she had, and she listened to a man who had never dug a foot of ditch in his life read out a paper that said her water was a crime and her crop was nothing, and her land would be taken. And she saw that the whole apparatus of the town and the county and the law had at last turned its full weight against her, and that a paper like that one in the hands of the bank could end her before her first true harvest was 6 weeks off. 3 years of waiting, and the whole thing was to be broken in a spring morning by a functionary with a leather case. She neither wept nor raged, because she had long since spent the part of herself that wept and raged. She asked him one question in a level voice. "Downstream users," she said. "You have written that I am taking water from the downstream users of the creek. Sir, my water has never touched your creek. It comes up out of that rock, there, above my ground, and I have let it down across my own 40 acres, and not one drop of it has ever run into the reach, because I am above the reach, and my whole bog holds every drop I gather. I am not taking one spoonful of water from any man in this valley. I am using water that was doing no living soul any good at all where it lay. How can a man be robbed of water he never had? It was, of course, exactly the right question, and it was exactly the question the county agent had no honest answer to, and the flicker that went across his self-important face told Orla, in an instant, the one thing she had most needed to know and had not until that moment known, which was that the paper was not honest, that someone had sent this man, that the machinery grinding against her was being turned by a hand she could not yet see. He gathered his papers and mumbled that the office would make its determination and that she would be notified, and he rode off the bench a good deal faster than he had ridden up it, and Orla Vance stood beside her flooded bog with her cracked hands hanging at her sides and understood, for the very first time, that she had a hidden enemy, and that her 3 years of quiet had not been quiet enough. She did the only thing she knew how to do against it. She went to the flour barrel and she took out the oilcloth book, and this time she did not read it for comfort, she read it for evidence. Because the old oilcloth memorandum in its soft covers was more than a manual, it was a record, dated and detailed, of the old law of water that the old country men had carried across the sea. The rule that a person who brings water to ground that had none, from a source that fed no other man, holds a right to that water by his own labor and his own finding, and that this was the very principle the American courts of the dry West had been building their whole system of water rights upon, first in time, first in right, the water belonging to the one who first put it to beneficial use. Orla could not have cited a statute, but she had a dated book in a dead miner's hand describing how buried water is found and let out by exactly her method, and she had 2 years of her own careful figures penciled into its back pages, the fall of the channel, the flow of the seep, the level of the bog, and she had, though she scarcely dared hope it would ever be needed, the plain, undeniable fact standing there in the sand that she had made water run where no man in the valley had ever made it run, and had taken it from no one. She wrapped the book back in its oilcloth, and she put it, not in the flour barrel now, but inside her dress, against her heart, where it would go with her everywhere from that day, because she understood that the book had just become the most important thing she owned, more important than the deed, more important than the $11, that the book was the difference between a mad widow squatting on a stolen creek and a woman who had earned by her own labor the only reliable water in a dying valley. And then she returned to the bog, because the harvest was 6 weeks off, and the Vines did not care about the county agent, and the only answer she had ever had to any of it was the next needful thing. Now the drought took hold of the valley in earnest, and the look of it must be set down plainly, because the town needed to see it before it could see her. Through May the creek fell, and through June it fell further, until the reach that had watered the whole valley since before any white man came was a chain of stinking green pools with a quarter-mile of white dry stones between them, and the pools themselves warm and low and going bad. The short grass on the benches, that should have been a foot of green feed by June, came up an inch and cured to gray standing straw before it could seed, and then the wind and the sun took even that. The hayfields along the creek that the whole valley counted on for the winter feed made a first cutting so thin the men left it lying, and did not make a second, because there was no second. And the cattle. The 2,000 head of the broken bit and the milk cows of the Ostranders, and the Dutchman's hay-fed beeves, and every head in the valley began, slowly at first and then not slowly, to walk the shrinking creek, looking for water that was not there and grass that was not there, and to grow gaunt and to go down. It is a terrible thing to watch a range die of drought, and the old people of Sabbath Reach never forgot it. The cattle bawling on the dry benches day and night, the dust that hung in the still hot air so that the sun came up red and went down red, the buzzards that came in numbers no one had ever seen, the smell that settled over the whole valley by July. Ferris Coyle, the big red loud man who had said the bench could sink into the sea, worked himself gaunt and gray trying to save his 2,000 head, hauling water in barrels from the last creek pools, driving cattle high into the rocks looking for a spring that did not exist, and losing them anyway. 10 and 20 and 40 head a week. His whole fortune drying up and blowing away as gray dust off the benches. The little places went first and hardest. The Ostrander boys' milk cows dried up and then died, and the Dutchman turned his beeves loose to fend for themselves because he could not watch them starve in the pens, and old Widow Salt's kitchen garden burned brown, and Sabbath Reach, that proud creek water valley, began quietly to break apart as families loaded wagons and pulled out east and south, abandoning the only thing they had ever trusted, which was the creek. Because the creek had failed them and they knew no other water in all the world. And up on the dry bench, above it all, where the whole town had agreed a mad widow was burying her hopes in dead sand, there was a flooded acre of grain. The first man to truly see it was the boy. It was the younger Ostrander boy again, the same one who had spotted her digging 2 autumns before, only he was not looking for a strayed cow this time, because the Ostranders had no cows left to stray. He was riding the bench in the dead heat of a July afternoon on a gaunt horse. Sent up to the high rocks by his father on the failing hope of finding any green feed at all, and he came over the same rise above Miller's Cut, and he stopped his horse, and he sat there in the red hanging dust, and he could not at first make his eyes believe what they were telling him. Down in the fold of the widow's dead field, in a country burned gray to the far mountains. In a valley where the creek was stones and the cattle were dying and the very air was dust, there lay a wide low sheet of standing water, blue where it caught the sky, cool, still, impossible, and around and through it a thick living mat of dark green vines running right down to the water's edge, greener than anything the boy had seen since the spring, green as the whole world used to be green. And wading out in the shallow of it with her skirts knotted high and her back bent to some patient work, alive and unhurried in the middle of a dying land, was the ditch widow the whole town laughed at. The boy did not laugh. The boy was 14, and his family's cows were dead, and he had just seen, on the deadest ground in Sabbath Reach, the only living water in the whole valley. He turned his gaunt horse, and he rode down off the bench faster than he had come, and this time when he told it at what was left of the feed store, the strange dark scar was not a grave, and the widow was not talking to the dirt. This time the boy said, and he said it with his voice shaking, that the Vance widow had water. Standing water. A whole field of it, high on the parched bench, in the worst of the drought, and green vines growing thick as a garden, and not one drop of it come from the creek. They did not believe him. Of course they did not believe him. A valley does not undo 2 years of contempt on the word of a boy. Ferris Coyle, gaunt and gray and half mad with the loss of his cattle, said the boy had been out too long in the sun and seen a mirage, that there was no water on the bench, that everyone knew the bench was dry, that the day a starving widow outfarmed the broken bit was the day he would eat his hat. But the boy held to it, and there were a few, the ones who were about to lose everything, who could not afford any more not to go and look. And so the next morning, a small, hard knot of desperate men climbed the bench to see the mirage for themselves, and Ferris Coyle, telling them the whole way what fools they were, rode along in the lead to prove them wrong. They came over the rise above Miller's Cut in the early light, and they saw it, and the whole knot of them reined in at once without a word, as men go silent in a church, and they sat their gaunt horses in a row on the rise and looked down at the thing not one of them had believed could exist. The bog lay flooded and blue and still in the morning light. A whole flat acre of held water in a country where a man had to haul his drinking water 4 miles, and the vines around it ran green and thick and untroubled, and here and there among the dark leaves, though the men were too far and too ignorant to know it yet, the small, hard first berries were already setting, pale now, that would ripen to crimson come autumn. And the channel, that dark scar the boy had once called a grave, ran up from the bog toward the western rock in a thin, unbroken line of dampness and green rush, carrying its slow patient walking water down out of the deep stone, the water that did not know there was a drought, that had never once needed the creek, that had been lying in that rock the whole time, doing no living soul any good until a mad widow with an old book of buried water got down on her knees and gave it a road. Ferris Coyle did not eat his hat, because a man like Ferris Coyle never quite does. But he took it off. He took his hat off on the rise above the widow's bog, before all the other men, without seeming to know he had done it, and he sat there bareheaded in the morning light, looking down at the only water in his dying valley. And something in the big, red, loud man went very quiet, and he did not say one word about mirages ever again. Now here is the part that matters, and it is the part the whole family of these stories turns on, so I want to be careful with it. Orla Vance did not gloat. There is no scene in this account where the ditch widow stands at the edge of her bog and tells the gaunt, broken men of Sabbath Reach what they can do with their creek and their laughter and their mad widow talk. She did not rise up from the water and crow. When she saw the row of men on the rise, she straightened her aching back and shaded her eyes with one cracked hand and looked at them a long moment, and then she went back to her work. Because the vines needed tending and the men on the rise did not. And if there was a hardness in the set of her shoulders, it was not the hardness of triumph, but the far older hardness of a person who has been. Right about a thing for 3 years and has paid for it in blood and does not need anyone's late permission to be right. The vindicating in this story is not done by Orla Vance. It is done by the water itself, and by the men who had to come to it, and by the boy, and by the wife who remembered, and by the long line of women, each of whom had borne a book of hidden water from one parched land into the next, and Orla let it be done and kept her own dignity out of it, and that is exactly why the valley loved her afterward in a way it could never have loved a woman who crowed. The men came down off the rise slowly, and they came to her fence, and they did not know how to begin. Because there is no easy way for a proud man to walk up to a woman he has laughed at for 2 years and ask her for the thing he swore she could not have. Ferris Coyle was the biggest of them, and it fell to him to speak. And he stood there at the widow's rail fence, turning his hat in his gaunt hands, and what he said came out of him rough and low, and not at all in the loud, jolly voice he had used across the wagons 2 years before. "Mrs. Vance," he said, I have got near 2,000 head down there dying for want of water, and better than 400 of them dead already. And I have hauled from the creek till the creek is stones, and I rode up here this morning to prove a boy was lying. He stopped, and he looked past her at the impossible blue water, and he made himself go on. He was not lying. I do not understand what I am looking at. I do not understand how there is water on this bench when there is none in the whole rest of God's valley. But I am looking at it, and my cattle are dying, and I have come to ask you, plain, if you would sell a man some water to keep his stock alive. I will pay whatever you name. I called you a fool in the street with the whole town listening, and I will say now, in front of these men, that I was the fool, and I would be obliged if you would let me buy your water anyway. It was as full an apology and as full a surrender as a man like Ferris Coyle had it in him to make, and it had cost him more than the 400 dead cattle, and Orla Vance knew exactly what it had cost him. She looked at him over the fence a long moment before she said the thing that made the difference between a small woman and a large one. "Mr. Coyle," she said, "I will not sell you my water, because it is not enough water to save 2,000 head, and I refuse to take your money for a false hope. But you may bring your weakest 100 head up here to drink where my channel runs out at its lower end, where the overflow spills off, morning and evening, as many as the seep will carry, and you will not pay me 1 cent for it. Because I have buried 2 children's fathers in this country, and I know what it is to watch a thing you love go down for want of what another body has plenty of. Bring your weak stock up at dawn. And, Mr. Coyle, tell the Ostranders and the Dutchman and the Widow's Salt to bring theirs too. There is not enough for the herds, but there is enough for the ones that would die first, and I will not stand at my own full water and watch a neighbor's milk cow die a quarter-mile off. My grandmother would rise up from the ground and take a switch to me. You could have heard a pin drop at that fence. These were men who had laughed at her, who had whispered about her children, who had let a county man ride up with a paper to take her land, and she stood there thin as a rail with her hands wrapped in bloody rag, and offered them her water for nothing. And not one of them had the first idea what to say to it. And the shame that went through that knot of gaunt men at the widow's fence was a cleaner and a harder thing than any triumph she could have thrown at them. Ferris Coyle put his hat back on and took it off again, and finally just said, "Horse, I will not forget this, Mrs. Vance." And he meant it, and he never did. But before I show you how the whole valley came to that fence, you should know about the man who did not come with hat in hand, because a story is only as good as the reckoning it hands to the man who earned one. And Piet Halloran had earned his. Piet Halloran had understood before any of them, of course, exactly what the drought was going to make of that 40 acres. Where Ferris Coyle stood at the fence humbled, Piet Halloran stood off in the town and grew cold and quick and dangerous, because the very drought that had humbled the loud men had turned the widow's bog from a valuable parcel into the single most valuable ground in the entire territory, the one dependable water in a dying country worth 10 times, worth 100 times what the valley had been worth in a wet year. And Piet Halloran had a plan already laid to take it, the plan he had been growing patiently across 3 long seasons, and the drought only made him move it forward. The bank's note fell due with the coming new year, and Orla could no more pay a note than she ever could, first harvest or no first harvest, because a first crop of a strange berry no Sabbath Reach merchant had ever bought was not $11 in hand, and Piet Halloran held her little stored debts besides, and there was, in his pocket, a friendly county agent's paper calling her diversion, unsound, and injurious. He had every piece he needed. He came up the bench himself, at last, on a fine horse, in a clean coat, courteous as ever. To end it, he did not come to the fence hat in hand. He came as a man comes who believes the law and the arithmetic are already his, riding right up to where Orla stood at the head of her channel, and he tipped his hat to her as he always had, and he asked after Dell by name, and then he told her, in his soft, even voice, the shape of the trap. "Mrs. Vance," he began, in that soft, even voice, "I have always had a regard for you, and it is because of that regard that I have come up here myself rather than let you learn this from a paper. The note your late husband signed comes due the first of the year, and we both know you cannot pay it, drought or no drought. I hold your store debts besides, which I bought up meaning to forgive them in an easier season, though I fear that season will not come. And there is a finding from the county that your bog here is an unsound and unpermitted diversion injurious to the valley that will support an action to drain it, whether the note is paid or not. I tell you all this plainly, out of that regard, because I want to make you an offer that is a great deal kinder than what the law is going to do to you. I will buy this parcel from you today, note and debts and all, for $200 cash in your hand and the fair east for you and your children. $200, Mrs. Vance. That is more money than you have seen in your life. And you may walk away from this hard ground with your children fed and your dignity whole, before the bank and the county take it from you for nothing. It is the kindest thing anyone in this valley will ever offer you. Now, I told you a long while back that Orla had not known she had a hidden enemy until the county agent rode up with his paper, and that from the flicker on that man's face she had learned only that someone had sent him. She had not, until this moment, known who. But she was a woman who had spent 3 hard years learning to read the land under the surface of a thing, the water under the dry ground, and she read the man in front of her now the same way. And in the space of that soft, even speech, she understood the whole scheme entire, the county agent in the bought-up stored debts, and the courteous freighter who had sold her husband a claim he swore was dry, and had watched her bog fill for 3 years with pale, patient eyes, and she understood at last, all in her rush, exactly who her hidden enemy had been the whole time. And it took every ounce of the hardness 3 years had built in her not to show it on her face. She did not show it. She let him finish. And then, standing thin as a rail in her tea-colored dress, with the oilcloth book against her heart, she did the one thing Piet Halloran had not planned for, which was to fight him out loud, in the open, in front of the 2 Ostranders and Ferris Coyle, who had come up that morning for their stock's water and were standing not 30 feet off at the low end of the channel, close enough to hear every word. "You sold my husband this ground," she said, and though her voice stayed low, she pitched it to carry to the men at the channel, and you swore to him it was dry. You knew it was not dry. You had found this water yourself years before, and you had failed to lead it out because you did not know the fall, and you sold the claim off cheap to a young fool rather than admit you could not get the water you knew was there. And then you came back, and you have watched me dig for 3 years, and you have waited like a patient buzzard for the bank to do your killing for you. And when the killing did not come fast enough, you paid a county man to write me a lie. That is not a kindness you are offering me, Mr. Halloran. That is a robbery with a soft voice, and I will tell you why it will not work. Piet Halloran's courteous face had gone very still. Mrs. Vance, he began, you are overwrought, and you are saying things where these men can hear that a woman in your position had far better not say. I am saying them in front of witnesses on purpose, she said. Now you will let me finish as I let you. Your county man wrote that I am injuring the downstream users of the creek. I have never touched the creek. Ask Mr. Coyle there, who has hauled that creek dry with his own barrels, whether one drop of my water has ever run into it. It has not. My water comes up out of that rock, above every man's ground in this valley, from a source that fed no living soul before I let it, and by the law of this territory, the very law the courts have built on first finding and first use, the water belongs to the one who first put it to use, and that is me, by my own labor, for 3 years, witnessed. I did not take it from anyone. I made it run where no man in this valley, including you, Mr. Halloran, was able to make it run. There is no injury, no unsound diversion, and there is no unpermitted taking, and I have it all set down, dated, in a book I keep against my heart. 3 years of the fall and the flow and the level in my own hand, and all the old law of found water beside it in a hand older than that. Your paper will not stand up against that book in any court in this territory, and you know it, which is exactly why you have come up here to frighten me into signing before I think to ask a lawyer. Well, I have thought to ask a lawyer, Mr. Halloran, and I will not sign. You must understand what a thing this was, a starving widow standing in a dead field, taking a soft-spoken moneylender apart out loud in front of the very men who had laughed at her, and doing it not with heat, but with the cold, plain force of a person who has the truth and the law both on her side, and has waited 3 years to say so. Piet Halloran had built his whole quiet fortune on never being contradicted in the open, on the soft voice in the back of the room that no one ever forced to raise itself, and he had no answer at all to being named, out loud, in daylight, in front of witnesses, as exactly what he was. He tried the soft voice one more time. You have no money for a lawyer, he said, and for the first time there was something under the courtesy that was not courteous at all. And that was when Ferris Coyle walked over from the channel, big and gaunt and gray, and stood beside the widow's shoulder and looked at Piet Halloran and said, She has now. The two Ostranders came and stood on her other side. And the widow Salt, who had come up that morning too, and had heard every word of it, said in her thin old voice that she would ride to the county seat herself, and swear to what she had heard about the county man's paper. And Piet Halloran stood alone on his fine horse, in his clean coat, in front of a widow and a handful of ruined neighbors who a week before would not have crossed the street for her, and he understood that the patient trap he had spent 3 years setting had just closed on his own hand, in daylight, before every man on that bench, and that a soft-spoken man's whole power is that no one looks at him too closely, and that the widow had just made the entire valley look. He turned his fine horse without another word and rode down off the bench, and the story of what he had tried to do went down the bench faster than his horse, and Piet Halloran was finished in Sabbath reach, not by any violence and not by any gloating, but by being seen, and that is the only reckoning this kind of story ever hands out, the only one it ever needs. I said the reckoning belongs to the man who earned one, and it does. but I want to be plain that she did not chase Piet Halloran out of the valley, nor did she rejoice when he went. The consequences of what Piet Halloran had spent 3 years doing came to him lawfully and quietly, in that the valley thereafter would not trust him, would not freight with him, would not borrow from him, so that within the year he sold out at a loss and left Sabbath Reach for good, and where he went the valley did not know and did not ask. Orla did not do that to him. He did it to himself over 3 patient years, and the drought and the daylight only let the valley finally see it. She took no part in the man's undoing beyond refusing to be undone by him, and there is the whole difference, and it is why she could sleep at night the whole long life she had left, which was a good deal longer than Piet Halloran's. And now I can tell you how the whole valley came to the fence, because now there was nothing left standing between Orla Vance and the vindication she had bled 3 years for. It began with the weak stock at dawn, just as she had said. That first morning after she made her offer at the fence, Ferris Coyle brought up his 100 weakest head at first light, driving them slow and gentle up the bench road, and the 2 Ostranders brought the few gaunt milk cows they had left, and Orla opened the plug at the low end of her channel and let the overflow run out into a shallow trough of packed earth she and Dell had built in the night, and the dying cattle put their muzzles down into cool, clean water for the first time in weeks and drank. And the men stood back and watched their stock drink, and some of them, hard frontier men who had buried their own fathers dry-eyed, had to turn away and look at the mountains for a while. Word of that ran down the bench, too. And the next morning there were more, and the morning after more still, until every family left in Sabbath Reach was driving its weakest stock up the bench at dawn to drink at the ditch widow's overflow, and Orla Vance, who 3 years before could not get a banker to believe there was water on her land, now stood each morning where the channel began and portioned out to the whole valley the one thing the whole valley could not live without. She did it carefully, because there was not enough for the herds, only enough for the ones that would die first, and she made no exceptions, and she took no payment, and she played no favorites. And this, too, the valley did not forget, that in the worst year any of them had ever known, the only reliable water was held by the one person they had all wronged, and that she portioned it out to them like a mother portioning bread among quarrelsome children, with no thought at all of who had laughed the loudest. There is a thing that happens to a community when it is saved by the person it despised, and it is not gratitude exactly. Gratitude is too small a word. It is more like the shame turning slowly into love, as a bruise turns colors as it heals. And by the middle of that terrible summer, the whole of Sabbath Reach had come to look up at the widow on the bench, not as a mad woman, but as the only sane one among them, the one who had known the thing they did not know, who had gone down after a wealth they could not see, and had shared it out for free when she could have sold it for a fortune. The emissary came in the worst heat of August, and the emissary, as it so often is in these stories, was a child. Ferris Coyle had a boy, his youngest, a solemn thin lad of 11 named Wick, who had spent that whole summer watching his father come home gray and beaten from the dying range, and who had listened at the supper table when his father, humbled at last, told his silent wife Adelia what the widow had done, and how she had done it, and how ashamed he was, and the boy had thought about it a long while, in the manner that quiet children think. And one evening at the end of that August, after the weak stock had drunk and gone, when Orla was alone at the head of her channel in the low light, the boy Wick came up the bench road by himself, on foot. having walked the whole 4 miles, and he stood at her fence turning a battered hat in his hands the same way his father had, and he said the thing that these stories keep saying, the thing that means the next generation will not make the mistake the last one made. "Mrs. Vance," the boy said, "my father does not know I am here. I did not tell him I was coming. I walked up on my own. He swallowed, and he made himself go on. I want to know how you did it, not to take it. My pa says a man ought to know how a thing is done so that a thing that good does not die when the person who knew it dies. I have watched you all summer, and I cannot understand how there is water on this bench when the whole valley is dust, and it is going to drive me clean out of my mind if I do not learn it. Would you teach me? I will work for it. I will haul and dig and carry, whatever you say, only teach me how the water runs." And Orla Vance, who had kept the secret of the water behind her teeth for 3 hard years, because a thing said out loud in Sabbath Reach became a thing the men could take away from her, looked down at this thin, solemn boy who had walked 4 miles by himself to ask to be taught, and she understood that the time for keeping it behind her teeth was over. That the whole reason her grandmother had made her learn the oilcloth book by lamplight was so that the knowing would not die on dead ground with the ones who held it, and that a boy who wants to learn a good thing so that it will not die is the exact answer to a life spent guarding it. So she opened the gate in her fence, and she let the boy in, and she took him up the length of the channel in the last of the light, and she began that evening to teach him the fault, the 1 foot in 400, the reading of the ground for where the water hides, the line of dark rush that marks a seep, the bowl of water and the string and the straight board, everything the old miner had set down and her grandmother had read her by lamplight. She began that August evening to pour into a coil boy at a fence, and she taught him all the rest of that year and the years after, and Wick Coyle grew up to be the man who carried the leading of hidden water to every dry bench in that whole country, and named the widow who taught him in every telling of it, so that her knowing did not die, which is the only true vindication there ever is. Then came the harvest, and the harvest is the picture I have been carrying you toward this whole long while. So let me set it down for you just as it happened, because it is worth the wait. The berries had set through the summer, pale, hard little knots among the dark vines, and through September, as the nights came on cool. They had done the thing that had made Orla's grandmother's people cross an ocean for them. They had turned. They had gone from pale to blush to a deep, hard crimson, a red so rich and so dark it looked almost black in the shadow of the leaves and burned like coals where the sun struck it, thousands upon thousands of them, a whole flat acre of small, hard, jewel-red fruit hanging in the green. And the vines held so heavy with them that Orla knew, walking the bog in the cool of a late September morning, that 3 years of blood had come to their harvest at last. And she harvested it the old way, as she had waded the bogs as a girl with her hems gathered up in one fist, as her grandmother's people had done it for 1,000 years. Which is the one thing about the whole enterprise that the valley never could have guessed and never could forget once it saw it. She flooded the bog, she went up to the head of the channel, and she opened the plug wide, and she let the slow, patient water run down and fill the banked acre not to its usual shallow hand's depth, but full, deep, until a whole flat acre lay under a foot, and more of still, clear water, and the vines were drowned under it, and then she waded out into the middle of it, shin deep, thigh deep, in her faded tea-colored work dress with the shawl rolled back to her elbows, barefoot in the cold water, and she took a wooden rake her son had made, and she began to comb it gently through the drowned vines. And the berries came loose, the small, hard crimson berries, each one holding 4 little pockets of air inside it, as the bogberry does and no other fruit does, each one floating came loose off the drowned vines by the 1,000 and the 10,000, and rose up through the clear water and broke the surface and floated. And they gathered, and they drifted, and they came together into a great thickening sheet of deep crimson. Spread across the mirror of the flooded bog, red on blue, red as coals, red as a thing out of a dream, a whole acre of dark red berries floating on still water in the middle of a valley, burned to gray dust, until you could not see the water any more for the berries, until the whole flooded field lay under a floating crimson skin so thick a body could have walked across it if water would hold you. That was the picture. That was the thing the valley climbed the bench to see, and once it had seen it, it never in 100 years forgot it. A weathered thin woman with sunk cheeks and cracked hands, standing shin deep in the cold, clear flood of her own made water, in a valley of dust, cradling in one chapped hand a heavy, floating cluster of deep crimson berries. Her eyes cast down on the fruit and not on the crowd at her fence, the low September sun coming warm and gold across the water and firing the crimson till it glowed, and behind her and around her, floating, the 10,000 more, the whole impossible red harvest of 3 years of patience, drawn up out of dead sand and hidden water by a woman the whole valley had agreed was mad. They came from every farm still standing. They stood at her fence in a long, quiet line. Ferris Coyle and Adelia and the boy Wick, the Ostranders, the Dutchman who had come back, the widow Salt, all of Sabbath Reach that the drought had left, and they watched the ditch widow gather her crimson harvest off the top of the only water in the valley, and there was not one soul among them who laughed. And there was not one soul among them who did not understand, at last, exactly what they had almost lost. The berries made her the money, and the money settled the note, and the settling of the note is a small, plain thing, I will tell you quickly, because you have earned the tidiness of it. Cranberries keep. That is the whole quiet genius of the crop her grandmother's people had carried across the sea. A barrel of them, packed cool, will travel 1,000 miles and arrive sound at the turn of the year when every other fresh thing is long gone and every town cook in the territory is desperate for something bright and tart to set on a winter table, and they will fetch, sound and scarce like that, a hard dear price. Orla Vance sent her first harvest out by freight to the towns of the territory that winter, and she was paid for a crop she had grown on the deadest 40 acres in Sabbath Reach with water no man believed existed, a sum that made Cyrus Broadwater at the Stockman's Bank take off his gold spectacles and rub his eyes and read the draft over twice. She walked into his bank the first week of the new year with the money to service the note laid out clean on his desk, and a good deal more besides, and Cyrus Broadwater, who was not a cruel man, only a careful one, a man who believed in arithmetic as other men believe in God, looked at the arithmetic of a widow who had made a fortune off a dry claim and understood that he had been wrong about. The one thing he had staked his whole careful life on being right about, which is what the ground can and cannot do. Mrs. Vance, the banker said, when you sat in that chair 3 years ago and told me there was water on that parcel and that I had none of us gone looking for it in the right place, I told you it was a thing the ground does to hopeful people. I owe you an apology for that, and I am a man who pays what he owes. He looked down at the draft and then back up at her. How in the world did you do it?" And Orla, who no longer had any reason on earth to keep it behind her teeth, reached into her dress and took out the oilcloth book, worn soft as cloth at the corners. And she laid it on the banker's clean desk and opened it to the cramped drawings of the hillsides with the water tables sketched in, and she said, "My grandmother did it, Mr. Broadwater, and her people before her, in a dry country a long way from here, and she read me this book by lamplight when I was a girl no higher than a churn, and made me learn every page of it. The water was always there. It has been in that rock since before this valley had a name. You did not none of you find it because you were all of you looking at the surface of the land, and the water is never in the place the eye first falls. It is under. It always was. I only gave it a road." The drought did not break that year, nor the next. That was the terrible mercy and the great teaching of it, that the rain did not come back as a valley always tells itself the rain will come back. And so Sabbath Reach could not simply forget its hard summer and go back to trusting the creek and laughing at the bench. The creek stayed thin. The snowpack failed a second winter and a third. And so the men of Sabbath Reach, who had watched a widow draw water and a harvest out of dead ground while their own creek-fed places died, did the only sensible thing that was left to them, which was to go up onto the bench, hats in hand, and beg her to teach them, and Orla Vance taught them. She did not teach them for money, though she could have named her own price by then, and no man in the valley would have blinked at it. She taught them as her grandmother had taught her, because she had come to understand that the whole point of the oilcloth book, the whole thread of women who had carried it out of one dry country into the next, was that the knowing had to keep moving or it died. And a valley of dead ranches was a valley that needed the knowing more than she needed their money. So through the second and third dry years, she went from failing place to failing place along the bench and along the higher ground, and she taught the men to read the base of the rock for the line of dark rush that marks a seep, and to dig down and feel for the wet, and to lay a channel at the 1 foot in 400 and no steeper, and to check the fall with a bowl of water and a weighted string, and one by one up and down the high dry ground that the whole valley had always thought worthless. The seeps that had lain in the rock since before the valley had a name were found and given roads. And thin lines of green began to run down the benches where nothing green had ever run. And the high, worthless ground that sat above the failing creek turned out to be, exactly as her grandmother's book had always said, the richest ground in the valley, because it was the ground with the whole of the country lying below it for the hidden water to run down into. Not all of them grew berries. Most of them grew feed and hay and gardens and watered their surviving stock off the new channels, and a few of the wetter benches took to the bog berry as Orla's had, until within a handful of years the high country above Sabbath Reach, that dry, despised benchland nobody had wanted, was a patchwork of green fields and flooded crimson bogs fed by hidden water. While the old creek-bottom places, the ones the big men had fought over, stood half of them empty and gray, and the whole shape of who was rich and who was poor in that valley had turned itself upside down, so that the last were first and the first were last, as the oldest book of all had always promised they would be. And they did not call her the ditch widow any more. They called her, up and down that whole country and for the rest of her long life, the water woman, and they said it as you say the name of someone who saved you, which every one of them knew by then that she had. There came a day, some years on, when a man rode clear up from the territorial seat, a surveyor and a water engineer for the young territory's new Office of Irrigation, who had heard the story as such stories travel and had not believed it, and who walked the length of Orla Vance's channel with a proper instrument and shot the fall of it foot by foot the whole way down from the seep to the bog, and who came to the bottom of it and stood there a long time looking at his own figures, and then took off his hat, as they all took off their hats at that channel sooner or later, and said that in 20 years of surveying irrigation works dug by trained engineers with crews and money and instruments, he had never once seen a field channel laid to a truer fall than this one that a widow had dug, by hand on her knees, with a clay bowl and a string, and he asked her, as the county agent never had, and the banker never had, whether she would let the territory write it down, how the water is found and where it is led, so that it could be taught to others in the dry country coming up. And Orla, who had kept a book against her heart for 3 years, because she was afraid the men would take her water, gave that engineer 3 full days at her kitchen table, and every page of the oilcloth book, and every figure of her own, and the leading of hidden water on high dry ground went into the young territory's record under her own name and her grandmother's name and the name of the old Cornish miner who had set it down first, so that the thread of women who had carried it across the sea and across the plains did not end on a dry bench in Sabbath Reach, but ran on out into the whole dry west, into ground none of them would ever see, watering fields for people not yet born, which is the only kind of forever that this life gives anybody, and the kind Orla Vance had been quietly reaching for all along. Her children grew up on the water. Dell, the solemn, watchful boy who had held his mother's ruined hand on the bank of the bog the night she nearly quit, grew into a man who could read the ground for hidden water as well as any engineer alive, and he carried the trade north into new dry country and did well at it. And he named his own daughter for his grandmother's grandmother, back down the long thread, and taught her the fall and the flow as it had always been taught by lamplight from the book. And little Susanna, the round-faced, tender girl who had gathered rushes in a flour sack and asked most nights when her father was coming back, grew up strong and unafraid on ground that had made a fortune out of dust, and married the boy Wick Coyle, the emissary, Ferris Coyle's youngest, the one who had walked 4 miles alone to ask to be taught, so that the widow the Coyles had once laughed at became, in the fullness of time, grandmother to Coyle children and the 2 families that had stood on opposite sides of a rail fence in the worst summer of the drought were made one family by the water and by a boy's good sense in wanting to learn, and there is no tidier justice in any of these stories than that the mocking house and the mocked house should be joined and go forward together, with the knowing kept alive between them. Orla Vance lived to be an old woman, older than the banker, a great deal older than Piatt Halloran, and she lived it on that same 40 acres, in a good house at last, where the wagon had once stood, looking out every evening over the flooded bog she had built with her own broken hands, and every September of her long life she waded out into the cold, clear flood of her own made water with her skirts tied up, even when she was too old to have any business doing it, and combed the crimson berries loose off the drowned vines, and watched them rise and gather and float into that great red mirror skin across the water, red as coals, red as a thing out of a dream, and she never once got tired of the sight of it, and neither, I think, will you, if you carry the picture of it out of this story the way I hope you will. Because here is the thing I have wanted you to take with you the whole long while, and I will only say it the once. The valley was never right that the ground was dead. The ground was only misjudged, as people get misjudged, by folks looking at the top of a thing and calling that the whole of it. The wealth was there the entire time, under the dry crust, in the deep rock, waiting. It only wanted somebody with the patience to go down after it, and the patience was never a kind of stubbornness, whatever the town believed. It was a kind of love that had learned to wait. Orla Vance did not beat the valley. She outloved it 3 years at a time on her knees in dead sand, and the water was only the proof. So let me leave you with the same small kindness I asked of you at the start, now that you have walked the whole way. If you have ever kept faith with a slow, hard thing that the whole world told you to give up, if there was ever a person, a grandmother, a mother, somebody, who taught you where wealth was buried that no one else could see, and made you learn it by heart so it would not die when they did, then this was your story too, and I would be honored to hear about it. Tell me down in the comments the name of the one who taught you, and the town you are listening from tonight, near or far. And if a story like this one is the kind you want more of, the kind where the mocked one is proved right and shares the water out for free and joins the two houses and dies old and unhurried, looking out over the crimson harvest of her own long patience, then let the little button know, so that more folks who need a tale of this kind can find their way to it, the same way the water finds its way down, quiet and patient and sure, if only somebody will give it a road. The rain came back to Sabbath Reach eventually, as the rain always does. But the valley never went back to trusting the creek alone, and it never went back to laughing at the bench. And to this day, they say, in that high, dry country, when a proud man tells a poor one that no water is to be had on his worthless ground, some old-timer within earshot will lean back and say, "Careful, now." That is exactly what the whole valley told the water woman, right up until the summer the creek went to stones and her dead field ran green. And they all of them came up that bench road at dawn, hats in their hands, and begged her for a drink. And then the old-timer will not say another word, because he does not have to, because everyone in that country already knows the rest, and always will.